Record to the cloud. Okay. Um, our focus tonight is on the executive branch. Um, but I wanted to make a few follow-up notes from last night's on the Constitution and statutes. I thought Katie's presentation was, um, very solid. I liked her bunching some of the topics together. I think she noted a few of the things that I've often highlighted, including she talked a lot about the University of California and the Regents, but Stanford University is mentioned, the State Compensation Insurance Fund, known by its acronym SCIF. That's the workers' comp insurer of last resort, and even the State Bar of California are set forth in the Constitution. And so it's interesting. There's a total of 32 articles, and those 32 articles have 370 provisions. Um, like its federal counterpart, the California Constitution is also the supreme law of the land, obviously just for the state. We call it the hierarchy of laws. You may recall one of the slides early on in Katie's presentation. Constitution first, statutes, regulations. That's the same at the federal and the state levels. So, in other words, statutes and regulations can't conflict with the Constitution. Regulations can't conflict with statutes or the Constitution. As she noted, the California Constitution is much more detailed, but similar to the federal government, the federal Constitution, the critical thing is the three branches of government. Now, it's interesting to me, at least, that in the U.S. Constitution, uh, Article 1 is the legislative branch, Article 2, the president, and Article 3, the judiciary. So we have them the same way. It's just ours are 4, 5, and 6. So Article 1 of the California Constitution is uh, the personal rights. Section 2 is voting and direct democracy. 3 is the state of California. And then we hit the three branches of government. And they're laid out legislative, executive, and judicial at the federal level and at the state level. But again, we've got a couple of, the personal rights and others. It was funny that one of the ones that she highlighted was I always cite in talks Article 1, Section 25. That's the right to fish in public streams. So we've got a lot of interesting provisions, uh, and then, of course, direct democracy. There's about 24 states. California is probably the most robust when it comes to direct democracy. It obviously does not exist in the federal constitution. So there's no right to recall the president nor members of Congress, right? And uh, there's no ballot measure to propose laws or referend or repeal laws at the federal government. We've got a lot of other unique ones that she highlighted, just to reiterate, everything from the environment to transportation, an article on labor relations, certainly local government, a lot on taxation, our state worker comp system for injured employees, people who are on the job and get injured. That program, that's a logical one for statute and then detailed regulations. Yes, we have that in the California Labor Code. And then there are regulations adopted by DIR, the Department of Industrial Relations, that oversees the workers' compensation program in the state. But it all stems from the California Constitution. Most other states don't have, those types of things in there. Anyways, on the statutes, As Katie mentioned, we have 29 of them. At the federal level, they give them numbers. So Title 9, Title 2, Title 7. California, of course, as she noted, provides names. So we start with business and professions and we end with welfare and institutions and, 27 other ones that are in there. The smallest one is the evidence code. It only has 500 sections. The largest is the government code with over 21,000 sections. All in all, because I counted them 3 years ago, June of 2022. At that time, there were 1,000, I'm sorry, 156,266 sessions of those 29 codes. So 156,000 individual sections or provisions of law. Some are a few sentences and some go on for several pages, as you can, probably imagine in that regard. So they're pretty extensive. The other interesting thing, as opposed to the federal level and most states where regulations outnumber the number of statutes, at least 2 to 1, often 3 to 1. That is not the case in California. We have just over, again, June of 2022. So there have been some minor modifications, I'm sure, just a few hundred on both things. But there were just over 60,000 regulations. So, for example, at the federal level, it's about 3 times the number of regulations as there are federal statutes. So, if that were true in California, if we have 155,000, we would have over 450,000 regulations. That obviously is not the case. Again, just over 60,000. So, just a couple other points I wanted to add to Katie's wonderful presentation. The first guest lecture, in fact, the very first day of class, just for people's background, um, when we originally were designing this course, it was entirely asynchronous. And I had thought about and then suggested to UC Merced maybe I would do a brief lecture on each of the topics under the 4 courses. And after I did that, I thought, maybe I'd reach out to some friends and colleagues. And so hence you've got my lectures, but then also guest lectures on the topics. Again, hoping to give you a little bit more flavor in addition to your readings and some additional background for better understanding and certainly exposure to folks. So and they all got to pick, what day and time sort of thing it worked for them. And so, that's the approach that we've taken. So Corey Jasperson, you may recall the very first night, the very first day from the Judicial Council, which again is the policy-making arm of the judicial branch here in California, sort of like the AOC or the Administrative Office of the Courts. We all have, between the state and federal governments, we have a lot of similar or analogous entities, naturally all by different names, right? Sort of like the chief executive is obviously the president at the federal level, and all 50 states, including California, have a governor, but the idea is sort of the same. So his focus was a lot on the policy making and how the courts are run, which is primarily that. Ann Patterson, of course, talked about the executive branch. I think she tackled a number of legal issues as well as practical ones, talking about things like separation of powers and the role of the executive branch versus the legislative, et cetera. So I just want to expound a little bit on some of those things and highlight the state agencies as well in my presentation to you. Again, Article 2 of the federal Constitution sets up the executive branch, naturally the President of the United States. It's Article 5 in the California State Constitution. By the way, feel free to just interrupt Um, if you have any questions along the way, and I'll leave some time at the end, of course, to chat about other things if folks want to talk about discussion posts, essays, or other such things. Um, so I think the obvious distinction between the federal and state executive branches is who's the chief executive, right? States have governors, all 50 of them call it a governor. Their legislatures can be different. 49 are two houses, only one is a unicameral, which is Nebraska, but they use different terms. Some use House of Representatives and the Senate or variations of that. Of course, in California, it's the Assembly and the Senate, which we'll get into great detail in the fourth course later in the fall. Um, and so they are just like the president is the chief executive of the federal government, so too is, the California governor. So the executive power, section one of each of these four sections grants power to those branches. So Article 6, Section 1, I'm sorry, is the judicial branch granted to the Supreme Court and the courts of the state. Governor is vested with the executive power. Article 5, Section 1. Article 4, Section 1, the legislative power this is unique, it's granted to the legislature, but it says, but the people also retain their power of initiative and referendum. So actually, the people and the legislature share the lawmaking power. But again, Section 1 of Article 5 vests the executive power in our governor. Section 2 talks about um, the requirements for being governor. First, that the governor's elected every 4 years, and all the constitutional officers are elected that way. We have 9 in the state of California. You have to be a U.S. citizen and a resident of California for the past 5 years to be eligible. Those are the two requirements. Section 3 is the so-called state of the state. So the governor is required to report to the legislature every year on the condition of the state. Two interesting things. One is a couple of years ago, during COVID, the governor did one in Dodger Stadium because before that, it's always been done in the assembly chambers before the assembly and senate. And then another year in the auditorium at the California Resources Agency. He also did something unique 2 years ago. He, for the first time, did not address the legislature or public, really. Instead, he provided them a written report and then did 4 days in a row in different parts of the state talking about aspects of the state of the state. He was scheduled to do one earlier this year, and it got rescheduled, and it's never been rescheduled. So I'm curious when the governor is going to comply with Article 5, Section 3. So this is the same thing as the State of the Union, right? Every year, the president is invited to Congress to report on the State of the Union. The California Constitution has the same requirement. But it says report. When the governor chose to provide that written report, um, all the media and others, started calling and asking, well, doesn't he have to do it? And I said, no, it doesn't specify. It just says report. It could be oral, it could be written. Historically, for decades and decades, it has been oral, again, presented to the legislature and put on live TV and live streamed on his, YouTube and Facebook channels and all that good stuff. But that was the first time that a written report was provided. So it only says report to the legislature, not exactly how. Section 4 says that the governor can require officers and agencies to furnish him any information that's related to the duties. Kind of sounds obvious. I don't even know why it's in the Constitution, but it is. The next section 5 is filling constitutional office vacancies. Now, this is kind of interesting because in Article 4, the legislature, it says when there's a vacancy in the legislature, the governor has to call a special election. And then the people of that district, assembly district or senate district, they're the ones who vote on it. The governor can't appoint a replacement even temporarily. So that seat could sit vacant for 6, 8, 9 months, depending on the particular timing. When it comes to the statewide officials, the constitutional officers, those are all filled by the governor. Now, they are subject to confirmation by both the Assembly and Senate. And this is also an interesting distinction because the Senate is the only body, like the US Senate, that provides advice and consent on gubernatorial appointments, members of the governor's cabinet, all the agency secretaries, the undersecretaries, the assistant secretaries, the department directors, the chief deputy department directors, etc. There's about 4,000 total appointees by the governor, about half of whom are subject to Senate confirmation. But when it comes to filling a constitutional vacancy, there's no special election called. The governor gets to make an appointment, and both houses have the opportunity to confirm or not confirm. We've seen that recently prior to 2024 when they stood for their own election. Before that, the Secretary of State, then Alex Padilla, got appointed to be the United States Senator from California to replace Dianne Feinstein, who had passed away in office. He appointed then Assembly member Dr. Shirley Weber. And so she was confirmed by the two houses. And then she went on in 2024 to be elected on her own for a 4-year term. So she filled the vacancy left by Alex Padilla. The same thing happened when then Attorney General Javier Becerra got appointed to be U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services by then President Biden. Governor Newsom appointed then Assembly member Rob Bonta. And then he filled out the remainder of the term, and he too got reelected on his own and is serving a current 4-year term. So we've seen recent examples of those constitutional office vacancies being filled. Section 6 is what's called the GRP power. A GRP is a governor's reorganization plan. And it basically says that by statute, the governor can reorganize the functions of state agencies. He can't do that for constitutional offices. So, for example, he can't, reorganize the Attorney General's office. The legislature would have to do that by statutory changes, et cetera. But if like he is creating a provision, hold on. Sorry about that. I had a client call twice in a row. Um, the governor's actually doing that with two agencies. Governor Brown did it before. Governor Schwarzenegger did it. So others have done it to reorganize some of the agencies and departments of the state. So we're going to have homelessness will be part of a state agency. We've never had a separate entity to deal with housing and homelessness in that way. And a governor's reorganization plan looks like a bill, and it's considered by the legislature. And essentially, they can vote to approve it, or they can just not act on it. And if they don't act on it within 60 days, then it takes effect. And that's what happened this year. So in the governor's January budget proposal, he also proposed reorganizing two state agencies. And after hearings by the Little Hoover Commission, blah, 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 It was approved, the legislature held hearings and didn't pass any disapproval measure, and so they took effect on July the 1st. Section 7 makes the governor the commander in chief of the state militia. This has come into play earlier this year, right? Just a few weeks ago in Los Angeles. Under federal law, a president, it happened once before 50 years ago, as we noted in the press, but a president can essentially usurp a state's uh, National Guard. Again, historically, that's never been done, but otherwise, the National Guard is under the power and authority of the 50 state governors. That's in all state constitutions, and Article 5, Section 7 makes our governor the commander in chief of the state militia, again, which is the state's National Guard. Our governor, just like the president, has the power to grant reprieves, pardons, and commutations. There's only one exception, that's impeachment. So if somebody is impeached from office at the local or state level, the governor cannot pardon them or commute any sentence if there were something associated with it. There's also a provision that requires, in one instance, the approval of the California Supreme Court, and that is for somebody convicted of 3 or more felonies. So, in other words, a single felony, 2 felonies, etc., can be granted a pardon. The governor can commute their sentences. But 3 or more, he has to get at least 4 of the 7 Supreme Court justices to approve of it. So he actually submits a petition to the California Supreme Court. The current one has granted all, I forget the number, I want to say 72 or so that he's placed before them. That's basically the end, the first 8 provisions. So there's more to Section 5, or Article 5, which we're going to get to. But the first 8 deal directly with the governor. Section 9 is the lieutenant governor. And she's in, currently, she's in 2 provisions, 9 and 10. 9 says she has to have the same qualifications as the governor and is also the president of the Senate. However, the president pro tempore, we'll learn later, really runs the Senate. In fact, the lieutenant governor only presides over the Senate one day, and that's every 2 years when they convene the new 2-year session. The only authority legislatively that the lieutenant governor has is to cast a vote on a 2020 tie. So it's not like at the federal level. You may have noted the current vice president, J.D. Vance, I want to say 8 or 10 times now, and then Vice President Kamala Harris several dozen times. When something stood at 50, he could provide the 51st vote to get it over the hump. The provision of the state constitution in California is they can only cast a vote when there is a 20 to 20 tie. In other words, if it were 20 to 19, Lieutenant Governor Kounalakis could not come in and cast the 21st vote. There have been only 2 of them in the last 25 or so years. I wrote it down somewhere and I've misplaced it, but anyways, I can track it down. Those 2 most recent examples, but it's a rarity in the history of California that's happened where there's been that 20 to 20 tie. In Section 10, it says that the lieutenant governor becomes governor, of course, when a vacancy occurs, right? But the lieutenant governor is first. We actually have, due to this provision of the Constitution, a statutory hierarchy of those who become acting governor. An acting governor occurs in 3 instances: when the governor is impeached, when the governor has any sort of temporary disability, and when the governor is out of state. Now, you may kind of chuckle about that. The last one, impeachment makes sense, temporary disability makes sense, but the governor's out of state, especially today in the 21st century. I mean, we have emails and internet and cell phones, and how can the governor not act as the governor even if he's across the state line in Reno? But it actually stops at the geographic boundary of the state. So even when the governor, and this happens, all governors have gone to like a cross-border thing with other governors, Lake Tahoe. And once they cross the border, they don't lose the governorship. They just have no power. And so Section 10 says the lieutenant governor automatically becomes acting governor, not governor, but acting governor, and does have the full power. Uh, in most instances these days, even though they don't run as a ticket like the president and vice president do, the lieutenant governor, certainly in the past 30 years, has been of the same party as the governor. The last time there were issues was the first term of Jerry Brown in the 70s, and then Republican Mike Curb did a few things when he was acting governor, and when Brown came back into the state and reassumed or assumed his powers, he reversed all those. There were one or two instances where they went up to the California Supreme Court, and basically the court said, yeah, the lieutenant governor was acting governor, so he had full power of the office, but once the governor returned, he could reverse all those things. So even when a somebody of a different party has taken over since then, they recognize that it's really the governor who ultimately has the power, even if they can't exercise it. Just as an interesting aside, the governor's press office, Democrat or Republican, when a governor leaves the state for an hour or 2 weeks vacation or whatever, goes abroad, goes to another state, whatever, they issue a press release and it actually says the governor has left the state. And then when he or she comes back, it says the governor has returned to the state. It seems kind of silly, right? But that's the official pronouncement that the governor's power has moved to the acting governor, and now the governor has reassumed, his powers. As I said, this provision of the Constitution also says that the legislature has to adopt, which they have, a hierarchy. It's called an order of precedence, and basically who gets to assume the office. So by constitution, it's a lieutenant governor, but after that, it's by statute. And the first person is the pro tem of the Senate. Next is the Speaker of the Assembly. And then we go to the constitutional officers. So it's not like we go through the constitutional officers and then to the legislature. The legislature goes right after the lieutenant governor, the two legislative leaders, and then goes to the constitutional officers. So last year in the summer, both, and this had occurred too with Toni Atkins when she was pro tem, but last year with the current pro tem, Mike McGuire, the governor and the lieutenant governor were out of state. That meant that the president pro tem of the Senate, the head of one of the two houses of a different branch of government, the legislative branch, was in fact acting governor, and he signed two bills. And so that was, kind of precedent. It had been done before, but obviously that's pretty infrequent. The lieutenant governor from time to time does sign bills. Last year, she signed a couple because the governor was out of town, etc. Section 11 notes that the lieutenant governor, the AG, the controller, the secretary of state, and the treasurer are elected at the same time as the governor, and they too are limited to 2 terms. Now, you may note that we've listed the governor, lieutenant governor, AG, controller, secretary of state, and treasurer. Where are the other 3? So later on, we learn about the superintendent of public instruction SPI. We're one of the few states that has an elected overseer of the K through 12, not the UC and CSUs of the education system. And due to Prop 103's adoption by the voters back in 1988, we have the only, or maybe one or two, but one of the only elected insurance commissioners. So he or she is elected statewide. And then the ninth office are the four elected members of the State Board of Equalization. And so they are set forth elsewhere. Section 13 makes the AG the chief law officer of the state. And there's lots of provisions related to the AG's role when it comes to the 58 elected county sheriffs and some other provisions. The only other interesting one is Section 14, and it's similar to a provision in Article 4 where a couple of things. One is no state officer can receive any sort of income from a lobbyist or a lobbying firm. Makes sense. They can't accept any honorarium. So prior to that amendment by the voters about 25 years ago, elected officials, particularly legislators, could get paid by groups to write an article in a newsletter or give a speech. Today, that's prohibited, and that doesn't just apply to legislators, it applies to all the state constitutional officers as well. There are also limitations on gifts, and the other provision is that the constitutional officers, agency secretaries, department directors, and others are under a what's called a 1-year revolving door ban. That basically, and that applies to legislators as well. And that basically says that you can't turn around for 12 months. You're prohibited from being paid to lobby your former where you served. So, for example, a legislator can't lobby the legislature for pay for 12 months. A governor, an agency secretary, a department director, they're under that same sort of prohibition as well. Getting back to the distinctions between federal and state, at the federal level, we have what's called a at the state level, we have a plural executive. At the federal level, we have a single executive. All right. And that is because, called a unitary executive, because we don't have those constitutional officers at the federal level. We only elect a president and vice president on a single ticket, and really it's just the president that you're, ultimately casting that ballot for. You don't cast a ballot for the attorney general, the secretary of state at the federal level, right? So it's a unitary executive because it's one executive, okay, the president. California, like a number of other states, has again what we call a plural executive. And that's because the executive level has a plural, a number of executives, not just a single one like at the federal level. The other thing that we have in the executive branch of government, and this is at the federal and the state levels, are independent agencies and line agencies. Now, it's interesting from a legal perspective at the federal level if you're reading any of these things, but there have been several examples of where the U.S. Supreme Court has at least temporarily, they haven't ruled on the merits, but they have temporarily allowed President Trump to remove members of what are supposed to be independent agencies. The idea between independent and line is, are they answerable to the appointing authority? A line agency, that's obvious. Where do we get the name line agency? Well, in the old days at the federal level and at the state level, if you've ever looked at it, there's a chart. So at the federal level, it's got the president up top, right? And then the agency secretaries, the members of the cabinet underneath, the departments underneath them, et cetera. And there's all lines, right? And all those lines go up to the president. Same thing at the state level. So the governor's cabinet are those agency secretaries, transportation, health and human services, natural resources, Cali, PA, etc. Not the constitutional officers, the agency secretaries. Under the agency secretaries, we have departments, and they're headed by department directors. They're all gubernatorial appointees. So they all ultimately report up the line to the governor, right? And so the governor and his staff, they appointed them. Yes, even if they were confirmed by the Senate, which most of those are, they're still ultimately responsible to their appointing authority. That is the governor. If the governor says to the agency secretary or department director, do X, unless they want to be fired, they would comply with the governor's request, just like at the federal level with the president. The second type of entity you have are independent agencies. And even though most of them are appointed by the governor and most are confirmed by the Senate, the idea is that they're supposed to have some level of independence and not be directly influenced by the chief executive. So let's talk about a great example that I often cite, which Katie highlighted last night, which is the University of California. The governor appoints the regents. The regents are like the board of directors of the University of California, but they're appointed for 12-year terms. So they're appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate for a 12-year term. What's the importance of the 12-year term? Well, a governor can serve a maximum of 8 years. So the idea is that once they're appointed, they're in there for 1 to 3 governors, right? And so, or sorry, a minimum of one and no, because you could only do 8. So at least 2, perhaps even 3 if there were 3 separate 4-year terms, right? The idea again being that, yes, I was appointed by, Jerry Brown or Gavin Newsom, but I'm going to serve for a longer period than and I'm now in this office for 12 years. That gives me some independence. And there are other examples like Katie cited, the Public Utilities Commission, and a number of other ones that are out there. So, um, under those state agencies, agencies at the top level, then departments, and then we have boards and commissions and bureaus. Okay. So the agencies are at the highest level. Again, an agency secretary appointed by the governor, they're members of the cabinet. They have a second in command. We call them the undersecretaries. And then they have deputy secretaries and assistant secretaries. These are all gubernatorial appointees, can be hired and fired on the spot. Most of them, require Senate advice and consent to serve. But they can be again hired and fired at will by the governor. The department directors, they're supported by a chief deputy, and usually there are several deputy directors, 1 to 3 of them, and some assistant deputy directors. Again, appointees subject to confirmation by the Senate, etc. Those boards and commissions and bureaus are usually headed by an executive officer. They too are political appointees. Most of them are all subject to confirmation by the state Senate as well. And as Katie noted, one of the critical roles of an administrative agency, of course, is administering the laws that are adopted by the legislature, by bills, which become statutes. And those regulations, of course, have to be consistent with the underlying statute. We're certainly going to talk about that more in the second class rulemaking, so we won't spend any time here. But I think a couple interesting tidbits on state agencies in California. There are about 220, believe it or not, that have rulemaking authority. So this is everything from the resources agency down to the, funeral directors, or no, the cemetery and funeral bureau under the Department of Consumer Affairs. Okay. So 220 roughly. That's a lot. Not all of them make rules every year, as you can probably imagine, but that's a lot of administrative executive branch entities there, right? They also have enforcement authority in many instances. So, under that same Department of Consumer Affairs, they have like the Medical Board of California. The Medical Board of California licenses and regulates the medical physicians in the state. So they administer the boards, the test, they license and regulate them. They can discipline them. They can take away their license. Okay. Like a lot of businesses and professions under the Department of Consumer Affairs, there's like 26 or 28 different bureaus, boards, and commissions. Medical board, nursing board, again, funeral homes, barbers and cosmetologists, etc. So these folks are the enforcement arm, the lawmaking arm. They've got some of those administrative agencies in the executive branch have a significant amount of authority. And they're really the ones who are, if you will, charged with, running the government. So as I mentioned, that rulemaking is what we call quasi-legislative, almost like, sort of like, um, they're granted that legislative, which may seem counterintuitive because Article 4 says the lawmaking power is granted to the legislature and shared with the people. So, how does the executive branch make laws? Well, they're granted the ability basically by statute, and we call it quasi-legislative because it's kind of like legislative. And their legislation, of course, is a regulation. They also have what we call quasi-judicial authority. And so, sort of like a court, they interpret laws, right? How do they interpret them? Well, they're the ones who are administering it. So if they are auditing a doctor, or determining did a doctor or a nurse or a barber, cosmetologist, funeral director, if they are alleged to have broken the law, the regulator, that administrative agency in the executive branch, gets to exercise sort of like judicial powers, and they're interpreting the laws and how they apply to these individuals, and then ultimately enforcing them. So, the other role of these administrative agencies is their ability to formulate and influence state policy and legislation in particular. So these agencies and departments will weigh in the legislative process. If they're authorized by the governor's office, they will take an official position of support or oppose. So if legislator X in the Assembly or Senate wants to do a bill on license, dealing with the practice of, again, medicine or dentistry, the dental board or the medical board or the funeral bureau could and most likely will weigh in on that legislation. If not during the legislative process, then when it reaches the governor's desk. So they'll recommend to the governor, sign this bill or veto this bill. As you can imagine, the legislature cares what they say, and certainly the governor does. Why? Because they're the folks who are administering and interpreting those laws. Now, it doesn't mean that the legislature always accepts their position. Maybe they'll reject it, but that bill is likely to get vetoed, right? In other words, if the funeral bureau says we're opposed to this bill and the legislature says, we don't care, we're going to pass it to the governor, is it likely to get vetoed? Yeah, it's likely to get vetoed. So they play a role in legislation and, of course, in public policy, right? Um, whether it's the Air Resources Board or Cal EPA, et cetera, they play a role in formulating policy positions. And of course, they also play a critical role in the state budget. How dollars are spent, how much money are we going to provide for implementing and administering the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, the renewal of cap and trade, all of these things. Those executive branch agencies and departments, they all play a role in that policy development. And obviously, they're spending state dollars, right? And their expenditure of those dollars, whether on people or on activities, is based on what's adopted by the legislature and governor and the budget, et cetera. So I raise this just to point out that these agencies really play multiple roles, again, in whether it's regulating a business or a profession or weighing in on the budget or formulating a policy stance for the governor or adopting regulations, right? Um, so they've got a very, very extensive role throughout this process to be aware of. So with that, in our remaining time, happen to field questions about the executive branch and agencies or chat about other aspects of the courts. I'm sorry, of the course. Tomorrow, I'm going to chat about the judicial branch, and then Thursday about local government, highlighting some of the things that I think you should be aware of in these different areas. Some of it, most of it will not be duplicative of any of our speakers. I've tried to work on that aspect. There might be some overlap, um, but hopefully you're hearing different aspects of these things. And obviously you have your readings as well, and then your research for your papers and writing that as well. So we're trying to, give you several forms of input in these different areas and aspects of government, and then obviously have you do some of your own research and writing in these areas. So with that, happy to field questions, or we can wrap it for the evening.
Chris, where are the recordings being held? Are they somewhere on the portal?
Yeah, they're supposed to, UC Merced. I just shot her a note to say, did you load last night's?
Oh,
So they should be up within a day or two
okay.
of the lectures. I don't know. Well, I'm not on the website right now, but I don't know if she's going to send them by, just an announcement, or if there is actually a section on the Canvas site where they can be posted. I'm waiting to hear back. But I am recording them and forwarding them to UC Merced, so they should be up soon.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I had a question, and I think I reached. Oh,
Go ahead, Brock. It's fine. I'll go after.
I think I'd reach out to you, but I just wanted to check in. I know on some of the first quizzes, on one of them, the answer for one of the questions was correct, and then on the next quiz, it said the same answer was incorrect. So I just wanted to follow. I don't know if anyone else had the same issue on the quiz. I
Can
just
you
wanted to follow up
resend
on
me
this.
that? Which are the two questions? Resend them to me and I'll look into it.
Yeah, can do.
One thing to keep in mind is that for good or for bad, this is also the guinea pig class. So there may be a kink or two here and there. We've tried to put it together as best as possible. Like I said, we did some last minute tweaks, like adding in the lectures and guest lectures and some other things. So tried to do as much quality assurance as possible, but might there be some little things here and there? Yes, hopefully they don't amount to more than two or three. But so just send me the quiz and the quiz number, and I'll look into it this week. Get back to you. And obviously, if I made a mistake, you'll get, credit for everything. Don't worry about that. So
Chris,
yes, yes, ma'am.
I had a question about at the administrative agencies, and I was curious if you
Okay.
could speak a little bit more about how the coordination occurs between the legislature or maybe the governor's office. Like, how do they get feedback from agencies on possible bills?
Yeah, I mean, generally well, the legislature requests it. Sometimes they're forthcoming and sometimes they're not. There are times where, you know, you can probably imagine where an agency or department is particularly busy with something that may or may not fit in well with the legislative calendar. But in general, any administration, even if it's, a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature or vice versa, they're going to generally try to work together. But in terms of bill feedback, yeah, legislators and their staff reach out. Every department and agency, so 220 odd ones, have a designated person. Usually it's a deputy secretary, a deputy director of legislation. And I've always said that they are the governor's lobbyists in this sense. Those are the folks who are communicating with the legislature about legislation. So when I mentioned earlier in the hour, hey, a department or an agency may take a support or opposed position, it's that like deputy director legislation who actually goes to a legislator's office or goes to a hearing, and she or he actually, speaks on behalf of the administration and says, our department or our agency likes this or doesn't like it. So they're the ones who are contacted by legislators and their staff. And so that's the liaison. Now, there's also the legislative deputies. They're called deputy legislative secretaries, and the legislative secretary is the chief advisor, chief lobbyist for the governor in the governor's office. There's also those folks, but generally it's the deputies in the agencies and departments who go over the legislature and talk technically, pros and cons of a bill, et cetera.
Thank you.
Of course. Anybody else?
I have a
And if you
question.
have anything, you can also do it tomorrow night or Thursday. So, and sorry about it's not ideal for me, and it certainly isn't for you to run these consecutively. I, tried to space them out just like I have for the other 3 courses, and due to guest and my travel and other schedule, these things happen. So it's not perfect. My apologies. That's one reason why we're recording, so at least everybody can get access to it. So I appreciate those who, are putting in the time and effort to be here day after day this week. So, but my apologies for that. Anyways, did somebody have a question or?
I did. Can
Okay,
you
go ahead.
clarify on the syllabus it has a grading scales, and how does that correlate with the certificate program?
Well, assuming I don't know if I'm going to answer the question correctly, but I mean, assuming you pass each of the 4 courses, then in January there will be a reception and ceremony at the Capitol uh, with some elected and appointed officials, at which the certificate will be awarded. So that's the idea.
Thank you.
Sure. I mean, I'll confirm with UC Merced, but that's my understanding of how they're doing the program.
Okay.
Anybody else?
I think that's it.
Okay, so tomorrow night, judicial and then local government. Your last stuff is due Monday. So essay, the quiz, and I think the only, I mean, I make, comments here and there. I think the only, most of the essays are really good. Did I finish last night's? I think so. There were several missing. Most of you had them. I think my biggest feedback on the discussion posts is making sure that you respond at least to 2 colleagues, but also to develop a response. It's sort of like this takes the place of an in-class discussion, obviously, right? Normally, we'd pose those types, or the instructor would pose those types of questions, and there would be give and take and a debate or a discussion amongst classmates in the classroom setting. That's essentially what we are creating with the discussion post. So a sentence or two is not, particularly helpful feedback or a discussion, right? So I think my biggest comment on the discussion post is most of your original posts you're posting, are consistently good, but some of the interaction or the responses to your colleagues. So the essays again are good. I think a number of you have done a tremendous job, including a lot of outside research. And that's definitely noticeable there. And nothing really, other than the point raised earlier, nothing has jumped out at me in terms of the quizzes, in terms of how folks are doing. Everything is from the readings. There is no outside reading requirement. The quizzes, you don't have to, go off and research somewhere. If you've read the materials, everything's in there. So, you don't have to go searching or jump on the internet or look for it. It's all in the reading. So I think everybody's doing okay quiz wise.
I do
So
have one more question.
of course,
When does the next class, like, do we roll right into the next class, and will we
you
need
roll right
books?
into it. Yeah.
Will we need books for that we need to like be
Yep.
buying now then?
Yes. Well, that's a good question. I think it's all set up, and I haven't been given the go ahead to hit publish. Let me inquire of Merced. So let me just refer to the calendar. Hold on a second. Yeah, so technically this course, this first of the four, ends this Sunday the 10th, and your remaining items are obviously due by 5 o'clock on Monday the 11th. The next course on lobbying and the budget process actually begin on Monday the 11th. So yes, in this very first cohort, they are running them one after the other. I just got a draft flyer from UC Merced. There's obviously only one offering in 2025, the very first one. But in 2026, they've already set it up. There will be two offerings. So basically to coincide with the spring and fall semesters. And they're going to run them one after the other. There's no perceived or no break indicated in that regard. Just so that you know a little additional background, at some point, it's several years away, but eventually UC Merced plans to offer a master's in political science with a California government emphasis. And these courses are laying the groundwork. I don't know if they'll continue to offer the professional certificate, but at least these courses are forming the basis of what will become a master's degree in political science with a California emphasis. So.
Appreciate that. And yeah, if there's any way we could get like that syllabus before the 11th so we can start buying books and stuff, I just want to make sure that we have stuff in to be able to actually do posts
Let
and
me
stuff.
just send, I don't want to get ahead of myself, so let me send Michael. Can I publish the second course, which begins on Monday? Let me just get approval, and if so, I can hit the publish button and then it'll appear on Canvas and everything will be there. The only thing, so all the guest and live lectures are in there. Just like this one, that's the one thing to just, let's call them tentative. Okay, they'll be recorded, so if you can't make it, you will get it. You'll be able to watch it afterwards, but let's just say those aren't locked in place. That's the only thing I would advise. Otherwise, it's the same thing. Oh, by the way, so in the next course, so you had 4 topics in this one, right? Executive, judicial, local government, constitution, and statutes. This next one is 2 topics, lobbying and budget over the 6 weeks. So you'll only have 2 essays and 2 quizzes, I think. I think in the 3rd class, there are 3 topics, and in the 4th, there's 4, if I remember correctly, or maybe vice versa. So there is some variation, but the idea is the quiz and essay goes along with one of those subtopics, right? So the next 6-week course is lobbying and budget process. The 3rd one is rulemaking and something else or another. And then the 4th is all legislative, the legislature, the legislative process, legislative drafting, and statutory interpretation. So that's another heavy one, the last one.
Can we just assume that these 2 books are your books on lobbying and the budget process? then?
Yeah, so I partially designed those practical guides for this course. And so, yes, there's one on practical guide to lobbying and practical guide to the California budget process. Yeah, you can get them. They're like 12 or 15 bucks hard copy, and then you can obviously do the electronic version. By the way, I don't know if you care or not, but I donate the proceeds of my books to the Capital Fellows program. Those are the Assembly, Senate fellows, 18 that are selected each year. I mean, it's not much money, obviously, but it's like a couple dollars each book type thing. Anyways, it goes to a good cause. I obviously don't write these things to make money, nor do I teach for that purpose. So for what it's worth. But yeah, so all the practical guides. So I have practical guide on the legislature, the legislative process, drafting, the budget process, rulemaking, etc. Yeah. But as soon as I get approval from UC Merced, hopefully tonight or in the morning, I will hit publish, and then you'll have access to the second one. They're still building the Canvas modules for 3 and 4. Like I gave them all the stuff, the quiz questions, the discussion posts, the essay topics, blah, blah, blah. They're building 3 and 4 right now. 2 is done. The master is sitting in my Canvas account. I just have to, get approval to hit publish. So anyways, that's it. Okay. All right, we'll chat tomorrow night. Oh, and one last thing. I don't have like set office hours. Email or, contact me and I can set something up. I know many of you, we've had email communications. But if you, want to chat, I'm happy to do so. Not just about the course. Sometimes in these types of things, folks like to talk about, if they wanted to become a lobbyist or they wanted to find a job in government or all those types of things. I'm happy to chat about non-course stuff as well, but just reach out. I don't have any set, office hours. I'll just chat with students whenever we come up with an agreeable time. So reach out if you want to do that. Okay, we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.